Who held Freddie Mercury's hand when he died, and why did nobody know his name? Garden Lodge, Kensington, London. November 24th, 1991. 7 o'clock in the evening. While the world held its breath outside those famous gates, while photographers lined up on Logan Place hoping for one final photograph, while fans gathered with candles and flowers, something was happening in a dimly lit bedroom on the second floor that would remain secret for years. Freddie Mercury was dying. Everyone knew that much. What they didn't know was who was actually in that room when it happened. Most people assumed it was Jim Hutton, Freddie's partner, who'd been with him through the final years. Or Mary Austin, the great love of his life who'd never really left despite everything. The inner circle, the people whose names appeared in every biography. But the man actually holding Freddie's hand when he took his last breath was someone the public never expected. Someone who'd slipped in through the back entrance of Garden Lodge for weeks, avoiding cameras and questions. Someone who'd known Freddie not as the stadium-filling legend, but as Fred, just a friend who happened to make extraordinary music. That man was Dave Clark, leader of the Dave Clark Five, a rock and roll pioneer from the 1960s who'd sold 100 million records before Freddie Mercury ever stepped on a stage. And what happened in that room between 7 o'clock and 7:15 on that November evening is one of the most private, most heartbreaking moments in rock history. A story about friendship stripped of everything except its absolute essence. Two men who'd conquered the world in different eras, brought together in a moment where none of that mattered at all. This is the story of those final 15 minutes, why Dave Clark was there when so many others weren't, what he saw, what he felt, and why, when he finally opened that bedroom door and spoke two words, "He's gone," he was announcing the end of an era to a household that already knew but couldn't bring themselves to say it out loud. Dave Clark wasn't supposed to become friends with Freddie Mercury. Their paths shouldn't have crossed in any meaningful way beyond industry functions and mutual respect from a distance. Dave had conquered the 1960s with the Dave Clark Five, rivaling even the Beatles for American chart dominance during the British invasion. Glad All Over, Bits and Pieces, Catch Us If You Can songs that defined an era. By the time Freddie Mercury was forming Queen in 1970, Dave Clark had already sold more than 50 million records and was transitioning into production and business. Different generations, different sounds, different worlds. But London's music scene in the 1970s and 80s was smaller than people realized. The truly successful artists, the ones who'd actually navigated fame and survived it, formed an unspoken club. They understood things about each other that the public never would. The pressure, the isolation, the strange reality of being recognized everywhere while feeling completely alone. Dave and Freddie first met properly in 1977 at a music industry event at the Royal Albert Hall. Freddie was riding high on Bohemian Rhapsody and Queen's growing dominance. Dave was there representing his production company, already moving beyond performing into the business side of entertainment. They talked for maybe 20 minutes that first night. Nothing profound, just two people who understood the machinery of the music industry from the inside. But something clicked in that conversation, a recognition of shared experience, perhaps. Or just genuine liking that had nothing to do with career strategy. They started running into each other more frequently at industry gatherings than at more private functions. Garden Lodge parties in the early 1980s where Freddie would invite an eclectic mix of friends from different circles. Dave would show up and find himself talking to Freddie about everything except music antiques, art, the ridiculous politics of the recording industry. The friendship deepened slowly, naturally, without fanfare. Dave became one of the people Freddie could be himself around. Not Freddie Mercury, the performer. Just Fred. A guy who liked Japanese art and collected stamps and had terrible taste in comedy, but laughed at his own jokes anyway. By the mid-1980s, they developed the kind of friendship where weeks could pass without contact. But when they did meet up, the conversation picked up exactly where it had left off. No performance, no pretense, just comfort. Dave noticed something changing in Freddie around 1987, a thinness that makeup couldn't quite hide, an energy that seemed to require more effort to maintain. They never discussed it directly. Freddie didn't discuss his health with many people, and Dave respected that boundary. But Dave knew. Everyone close to Freddie knew, even if the official silence remained unbroken. The frequency of their contact actually increased as Freddie's health declined. Not because Dave wanted to insert himself into a tragedy, but because Freddie seemed to value the company of people who'd known him before the diagnosis became the defining fact of his existence. Dave would visit Garden Lodge every few weeks, usually entering through the back to avoid the photographers who'd started gathering even before Freddie's public statement. They'd sit in the living room or, as Freddie's mobility decreased, in his bedroom. Sometimes they'd talk. Sometimes they'd just sit in comfortable silence while Freddie dozed. Dave never brought pity to those visits, just presence. And Freddie, who'd spent his life surrounded by people who wanted something from him, seemed to find that presence valuable. By November 1991, Freddie's condition had deteriorated dramatically. He'd released his final statement on November 23rd, confirming what everyone already suspected. He had AIDS, and he was dying. The statement was released on a Saturday. By Sunday morning, Garden Lodge was under siege. Fans, photographers, television crews, everyone descending on Logan Place hoping for something, anything, a glimpse, a statement, confirmation of the worst. Inside the house, a different reality existed. Freddie was in his bedroom on the second floor, surrounded by the few people he'd chosen to have close during these final hours. Jim Hutton, who'd cared for Freddie with unwavering devotion. Mary Austin, who'd never really left, despite their romantic relationship ending years before. Peter Freestone, Freddie's personal assistant, managing the household logistics even as his employer slipped away. And Dave Clark, who'd arrived Saturday evening and hadn't left. Sunday, November 24th, moved with strange slowness inside Garden Lodge. Outside, the world spun at normal speed, newspapers printing obituaries prepared weeks in advance, radio stations organizing tribute programs, fans gathering with flowers and photographs. Inside, time felt suspended. Freddie drifted in and out of consciousness. The morphine kept the pain manageable but created a fog that made communication difficult. Sometimes his eyes would open and he'd seem to recognize the people in the room. Sometimes he'd drift in some private space where no one could follow. The people closest to him took turns sitting with him, making sure he was never alone. Mary would sit for hours, sometimes talking to him, sometimes just being there. Jim would adjust pillows, check medications, provide the physical care that had become his responsibility. Peter would handle phone calls and shield everyone inside from the chaos gathering outside. And Dave would sit quietly in the corner, available but unobtrusive, present because Freddie had wanted him there. Around 6:30 that evening, Mary stepped out of Freddie's bedroom to get some rest in another room. She'd been there for hours and was emotionally and physically exhausted. Jim was downstairs dealing with something related to the household. Even in crisis, practical matters required attention. Peter was handling phone calls from Freddie's family and from Queen's management, trying to coordinate what would happen in the hours and days ahead. Which meant that when Dave Clark walked into Freddie's bedroom around 6:45, he found his friend essentially alone for the first time that day. The room was dimly lit. Freddie had always hated harsh overhead lighting, preferring the soft glow of table lamps. Even now, dying, his aesthetic preferences were being honored. One lamp near the window provided just enough light to see by, casting the rest of the room in gentle shadows. Dave pulled a chair close to the bed, sat down, looked at his friend. Freddie Mercury, the man who'd commanded Wembley Stadium, who'd made 72,000 people sing in unison, who'd created Bohemian Rhapsody and We Are the Champions, and a dozen other songs that would outlive everyone in this room, looked impossibly small in that bed. The illness had stripped away so much. The weight, the energy, the physical presence that had filled stages and recording studios. What remained was essential Freddie, the person underneath the performer, the human being who'd been Fred Bulsara before he became Freddie Mercury. Dave reached out and took Freddie's hand, the hand that had played piano on Somebody to Love, the hand that had gripped microphone stands and conducted audiences and gestured dramatically during performances. The hand that had once been so vital, it seemed to contain its own energy source. Now it felt like paper, like something that might crumble with too much pressure. Freddie's breathing was shallow, irregular. Each breath seemed to require conscious effort, as if his body was forgetting how to perform this most basic function. Dave sat there holding that hand, not speaking, just being present. Outside, he could hear distant sounds from the street voices, camera shutters, the general noise of the vigil forming at the gates. Inside this room, everything was quiet except for Freddie's labored breathing. Dave found himself thinking about the first time he'd seen Freddie perform live. Not at some industry showcase where everyone was performing competence and professionalism, but at a Queen concert in 1977, shortly after they'd first met properly. Dave had gone partly out of curiosity and partly out of that professional interest musicians have in watching other musicians work. He'd been unprepared for what he witnessed. Freddie owned that stage with a completeness Dave had rarely seen, not through volume or theatrics alone, but through absolute confidence in his connection with the audience. Freddie knew with certainty, that everyone in that arena was there for him, and he gave them everything in return. Walking off that stage, Freddie had been drenched in sweat, buzzing with adrenaline, completely alive. The memory of that vitality made the present reality almost unbearable. Dave glanced at the clock on the bedside table. 7 o'clock. The light outside was completely gone now, London settling into its November darkness. Freddie's breathing changed slightly, became more shallow, the intervals between breaths growing longer. Dave squeezed Freddie's hand gently. "I'm here, Fred," he said quietly. "You're not alone." He didn't know if Freddie could hear him, didn't know if consciousness remained behind those closed eyes. But he said it anyway, because the alternative sitting in silence while his friend slipped away felt impossible. The minutes passed with agonizing slowness. Dave noticed details with hyper-clarity that comes from trauma. The pattern on the wallpaper, the way the lamplight caught the edge of a picture frame, the sound of his own breathing mixing with Freddie's. Around 7:10, Freddie's breathing became even more labored, longer pauses between inhales, each breath sounding like it might be the last. Dave held that hand tighter, as if physical contact could somehow anchor Freddie to this world a little longer. He found himself mentally bargaining with forces he didn't necessarily believe in, offering trades that couldn't possibly be accepted. Anything for a few more minutes, a few more breaths, a little more time with his friend. But time doesn't negotiate. It moves forward regardless of what we're willing to sacrifice to slow it down. Freddie took a breath, exhaled slowly. The pause before the next breath extended. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Dave leaned forward, still holding that hand, watching Freddie's chest for any movement. Nothing. He waited, counting silently. 30 seconds. A minute. No breath came. Dave sat there for a moment longer, still holding Freddie's hand, not quite able to process what had just happened. The finality of it. The sudden, absolute transition from living presence to absence. The hand in his grip still held warmth, but something essential had left. The person who'd inhabited this body, who'd filled stadiums and created art, and made people feel things they couldn't articulate, was gone. Dave gently placed Freddie's hand back on the bed, arranging it carefully as if precision mattered. He stood up slowly, his legs stiff from sitting in the same position for so long. He walked to the bedroom door, opened it. Peter Freestone was in the hallway, having just finished a phone call. Dave looked at him and said 2 words. "He's gone." Peter's face crumpled immediately. He'd known this was coming, had been preparing for it intellectually for weeks. But intellectual preparation means nothing when the moment actually arrives. The next hours became a blur of necessary actions, informing Jim and Mary, calling Freddie's family, contacting the doctor who'd been managing Freddie's care, beginning the process of transitioning from caring for a dying person to managing a death. Through it all, Dave moved quietly, helping where he could, staying out of the way when necessary. He'd witnessed the most private moment, Freddie's actual death, but what followed required the people who'd been managing Freddie's daily care. Jim and Mary and Peter knew what needed to happen. Dave's role was finished. He left Garden Lodge late that night, slipping out the back entrance to avoid the press still gathered at the front. Drove home through London streets that didn't know yet that Freddie Mercury was dead. The official announcement wouldn't come until the next morning. Dave Clark never spoke publicly about being in that room when Freddie died. Never sold the story. Never wrote a tell-all book. Never even confirmed his presence during interviews unless directly asked. And even then, he kept details private. Years later, when information about Freddie's final hours finally emerged through other sources, Dave's name appeared almost as a footnote. The man who'd been there, the unexpected friend, the person who'd held Freddie's hand through those final minutes, not because cameras were watching or history was being made, but because friendship meant showing up when it mattered most. In 2016, 25 years after Freddie's death, Dave Clark gave a rare interview about his friendship with Freddie. The interviewer asked what he remembered most about that final evening. Dave was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, how small he looked. Freddie on stage was this enormous presence, larger than life. But at the end, he was just a person, just my friend Fred. And I'm grateful I got to be there with him, that he wasn't alone. The interviewer pressed for more details. Dave declined. Some moments are private, he said. They don't belong to the public. They belong to the people who lived them. That respect for privacy, that refusal to capitalize on tragedy, defined Dave's relationship with Freddie both in life and death. He'd been Freddie's friend not because of what Freddie Mercury, the icon, could offer, but because of who Fred Bulsara, the person, was underneath the fame. And when the end came, when everything else stripped away and only the essential remained, Dave had been there, holding a hand that had created so much beauty, bearing witness to a transition that everyone experiences but no one can truly prepare for, being present in the most profound sense of that word. The world remembers Freddie Mercury through his music, through concert footage and recordings and the larger-than-life persona that made him unforgettable. But in a dim bedroom at Garden Lodge on November 24, 1991, at approximately 7:13 in the evening, Freddie Mercury died not as an icon, but as a person, held by a friend who valued him for reasons that had nothing to do with chart positions or stadium shows. That's not the story people usually tell. It's not dramatic enough, not public enough. It doesn't fit the mythology we build around legends. But it's true. And in its quiet, private way, it reveals something important about both men. Fame is loud. Death is quiet. And in between those extremes, friendship exists as one of the few things that remains genuine when everything else becomes performance. Dave Clark understood that. Freddie Mercury, despite the spectacle of his public life, understood it too, which is why, on the worst day of his life, Freddie was surrounded by people who loved him for who he actually was, not for what he'd accomplished or what he represented, just for himself. And Dave Clark, holding his friend's hand through those final breaths, gave Freddie something more valuable than any audience's applause: companionship in the moment when we're all finally completely alone. That's the story of those 15 minutes. Not dramatic, not public, just real. Two men, one room, the end of a life and the endurance of friendship. Simple and profound and entirely private, exactly as Freddie would have wanted it.